Okay, so the Tax Justice Network is launching the Financial Secrecy Index 2018. But what, I hear you ask, is the Financial Secrecy Index? The index combines two components: measures of financial secrecy based on objectively verifiable criteria. Typically we use data collected by international organisations assessing individual jurisdictions on a comparable basis. There are 20 indicators built on more than 50 variables underneath. We combine that secrecy measure with a measure of global scale. How important is this jurisdiction in terms of providing financial services offshore to non-residents? So who are the jurisdictions at the top of the Financial Secrecy Index? Remember, these aren't necessarily the most secretive jurisdictions, but they're the jurisdictions whose role in global finance means that their secrecy poses the biggest global threat, promoting corruption and tax abuse around the world, undermining human rights. In the first place, as it has been since 2011, Switzerland, the great defenders of banking secrecy. And even now, when they've been forced to sign up to the automatic exchange of tax information, eroding that bank secrecy, they're still limiting very tightly the number of countries they'll actually provide that transparency to. Earlier this year, Swiss politicians were debating whether or not they could exclude a whole set of developing countries on the grounds of their corruption. Now that's a joke when you think that Switzerland in this position are arguably the biggest single driver of corruption around the world. Second place, we have a mover, the United States of America. Up from third place, only up one position, but that's a big shift because often we've seen it quite static at this point, the established providers of financial secrecy. What's happened here? It's not that the United States has actually become significantly more secretive, it's that it stood still while the rest of the world has, by and large, become more transparent. In third place, another long-standing secrecy jurisdiction of great concern, the Cayman Islands. Small geographically, but actually a big player in terms of the provision of international financial services, and highly secretive with it. That's closely followed in fourth and fifth place by Hong Kong and Singapore, two jurisdictions closer to the Chinese sphere of influence, providing a lot more secrecy across that part of the world. Big global players too though, and again with a UK connection. It's worth saying that once again we find if we lump together the UK with its overseas territories and crown dependencies, where the UK has the right still to impose legislation, that UK secrecy network would take top place, even above Switzerland, in the Financial Secrecy Index. So while the UK itself may be relatively transparent, it has the responsibility for the biggest secrecy network in the world. So once again, it's those countries who are often loudest denouncing others for their corruption, Switzerland and the United States, who find themselves at the top of the Financial Secrecy Index, arguably showing that they themselves are the greatest drivers of corruption around the world through the financial secrecy that they promote and market to citizens of other countries and to companies. Why does secrecy matter? And it matters because it undermines the fair functioning of markets and it undermines the fair functioning of states. Businesses need to know they're on a level playing field, that multinationals, for example, can't dodge all of their tax responsibilities, leaving domestic businesses instead to foot the bill. Individuals need to know that we're all more or less paying fairly into the tax system. In fact, when people don't think that others are paying fairly, it undermines their own incentives to comply, and you get this erosion of tax morale and of tax compliance that's really damaging for social capital, not just for revenues. And then states need those revenues in order to provide public education, public health, public investments in infrastructure that allow markets to work, and so on, public administration. Without that, we can't hope to support economic growth, to challenge the inequalities, income inequalities, wealth inequalities, but also inequalities by gender, by ethno-linguistic group, the kind of inequalities that face people living with disabilities that we need effective states to be able to make progress on. And so ultimately, financial secrecy constitutes a poisonous, a pervasive threat to the progressive realisation of human rights all around the world. We should all care deeply about this, and we should all be pushing our policymakers to set minimum international standards with meaningful sanctions for jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate. Ultimately, that means a global convention on financial transparency, ideally at the United Nations. That's why this year we'll be asking the United Nations Secretary General to put in process exactly that convention, to bring together the countries of the world to discuss the minimum levels of financial transparency that everyone should be held to account for delivering. The Financial Secrecy Index 2018 tells you just who the biggest threats are to that process. They need to get on board now and start addressing the damage that they're causing to human rights all around the world.